Well, hello, everyone. Whoever you are, if you're associated with the former Smart Life Forum and the current Silicon Valley Health Institute, I salute you. This has always been perhaps my top favorite venue because like Susan, who thank God is still keeping it going, this is a group of courageous, forward-thinking, beyond open-minded, and very supportive of me over the years. So I've always enjoyed the live presentations and interactions, and I'm hoping that we can do some interacting today. I've suggested to Susan that we have a Q&A break at about 45 minutes in, and then we'll go on and have another break. We're estimating this at about 2 hours, and I'm hoping that you can stick with it. There's 10 years worth of information that I haven't given this particular group, and some of it I haven't given at all, either because I didn't have confidence that the people who were with me during the Zoom presentation could handle it and or understand it, and partly because a lot of it really is brand new. I want to give you just a little bit of a summary of what's been going on for me. A lot of people say, "Where have you been?" And so I need to go back to 2012 when I was last speaking at the then Smart Forum and introducing the revised version of my first book, The Diet Cure. Soon after that, I went to New York and sold a third book. And the third book is what I want to talk about today. The mood cure issues, my second book, The Mood Cure, which both of the first two books have been incredibly well received, and they continue to be. They are considered to be publishing phenomena. The Mood Cure has hundreds and hundreds of 5-star reviews, and we get emails and even phone calls almost on a weekly basis still. And those books came out in 2000 and 2003, respectively, telling us, and the Mood Cure in particular, the phrase that they use when they call or email is, "It has saved my life." So I'll be alluding to it a little bit here, but there are some new progress in the Mood Cure realm that I can refer to if we have time. The reason that I wrote the third book, and the reason that I'm talking about it really pretty much exclusively here today, and have been talking about it pretty exclusively since it came out in 2018, is that COVID happened. And right as it was, just after it came out, we were getting some momentum going with it. And the reason I wrote it in the first place was because it was clear that we desperately, desperately needed this particular information to be made available to everyone worldwide. And I'm going to explain right now why. Our current condition is, there's no big enough word for it, but I'm calling it a worldwide diet-caused 3-part epidemic. And it's really, of course, beyond that, but deformity, disease, and depression. And taking the premise that I always come from, that these kinds of problems, unnatural overweight, unnatural disease, unnatural levels of depression, anxiety, and other negative moods, are false. We're overcome by these epidemics, these curses of our current diet, but we've got to posit them as false. We are not overweight because we are doing something wrong. Our health is not failing us in unprecedented ways because we're doing something wrong. and our mood is not failing us. In spite of COVID, we see people all the time who've come in who are overeating and suffering from, unprecedented levels of stress, depression, and anxiety, and it all disappears, and COVID is still going. The true weight, the true appetite, the true health, the true mood is available to us. It's our genetic legacy. It is a millions of years old legacy that we can reclaim. And that's the real definition of the craving cure. We're talking about curing us from our new techno-carbs diet. Techno-carbs is a term that I invented to try and distinguish the kind of foods that we're eating now almost exclusively from real foods. And in order for everyone who's on this call to understand what I mean about the falseness of the symptoms that we're experiencing, these epidemics that we're experiencing, they are all consequences of this extraordinary change that took us from traditional foods to techno-carbs, to substances that have been specifically designed, particularly starting in the 1960s, but particularly starting in the 1970s, to alter our brain's ancient and perfect appetite and pleasure chemistry, our native appetite, our native ability to enjoy the subtleties of a huge variety of foods and that we have been playing with and creating extraordinary cuisines worldwide for millennia, beyond millennia. We started cooking 2 million years ago. So we've been at play since then. Nobody cooks anymore because we are addicted to the foods that we are now overeating. And I want to talk just a minute about, I'm going to talk about the two ways in which our current snack foods, techno-carbs, are impacting our appetite and pleasure chemistry. But before I do that, what I've found is, as I've been talking about this book, and even before that, when I was talking about the revision of the diet cure, in 2013, when that revision came out, that at least half of every group that I spoke to was really not aware of any differences between what we're eating, how we're eating, our weight, and whatever. They didn't know the historical context. They weren't aware that things had ever been different. The presumption was that we have always struggled with our weight. We've always struggled with overeating, and we've always been in need of antidepressants. And so I'm going to assume that there are a number of people here who are under 70 years of age and didn't actually experience for themselves what, as semi-adults anyway, what the world was like, of the eating world was like, in our weights, in our attitudes towards our bodies. What were they like before the current era, the 21st century? So I'm going to take us on a little excursion back, so to bring us up to date, up through and including the 1970s, so that you can get an idea of some of the information from the craving cure that explains why we need a craving cure. So we're going back to the 1950s. Sorry. So just imagine with prediabetes, which is a totally new diagnosis of the 21st century, and type 2 diabetes, completely unknown, really. But more graphically, literally, this is a typical crowd scene from the 1950s. And we'll finish up our entire presentation with another picture from the 1950s of a prom. But I just want you to look, we're looking at women who are every age and every race. Are there some men here? I don't think so. At any rate, this is typical. And I think you can see that everyone, including the pregnant lady in the front, the third from the right, is slender. And the 50s were a time where it was all out. We were not suffering a depression. We were not skimping on food. We had butter again. We had cream again. We had big pieces of meat again. We had everything that we'd ever loved in the past again, and we were enjoying it. We were cooking like mad. We were experimenting with recipes, but within the context of the following phrase: 3 squares. This is one of the most important things to remember about our lives, at least here in America, when our bodies were our own and our health was good. It was starting to erode. Cold cereal was here, which was really just an excuse to pour, a half a cup of sugar on your cereal every morning. So, but on the weekends, at least we had, oatmeal and eggs and bacon and ham and whatever. Right, Susan, thank you. So, but no one ever would consider not having 3 full meals a day. It was not to be thought of. It was a scandal. A mother who didn't provide 3 full meals, a teenager who didn't eat their breakfast, lunch, and dinner, who wanted dessert first. No, dessert never came first. We knew that if we started with sugar, we would never get to a full meal. And those full meals were sacrosanct. So what about dessert? That was the only sugar that a lot of people had until the cold cereals came in. And what would it consist of? A homemade piece of pie or cake. And all of those things were made with real butter. They were made with nuts. They were full of nutrients. Eggs. You'd never make a cake without loading it up with eggs. Cream. All kinds of traditional foods, which we began to wince about only in the 1960s. We'll get back to them in a minute. So I just want to remind you that if you're in the category of a young man who responded when I asked the following questions at a book signing in 2013, does everybody know what 3 squares means? And he said, nobody answered at all. And finally, he reluctantly suggested that could it mean 3 nerds? He really had not ever been acquainted with that concept. You cannot live without those 3 meals. And everybody knew it was a code word, 3 squares, of course. So weight was such a non-issue. It was like eye color. We realized that there were some variations, like in height, that was genetic. We knew that people were following genetic typology. We didn't have to know very much about genetics to know that. It was obvious. So there was no self-consciousness really about it. And that's why there were no weight surveys conducted before 1960. There was absolutely no reason to do that. Nobody was worried about it. It hadn't been very long since we had been terribly worried about underweight because we were starving in the Depression, literally. People starved to death, many people. So moving into the 60s, still plenty of money, if not more, plenty of good food. The hippie movement brought in a return of appreciation for whole wheat bread. They introduced the huge meal salad. So we added some good things to this basically health promoting diet that we were still holding on to in the 50s. So, but things were starting to shift here, and I just want to make a couple of points. I mean, you can look, now we have, again, all races, all ages, everybody is at what was considered a normal weight at that time. And so we were eating a lot of sugar in the 50s, at least 90 pounds a year, but it went up to 120 pounds at least in the 60s. And diabetes rates went up to a whopping 0.9%. It's now, when we include prediabetes, 50%, with at least 20%, and that's of adults, with at least 20% of children of all ages, even infants, experiencing overweight and moving, and many of them already experiencing prediabetes and full diabetes as well. So minor weight gain started. And we can now point to the kind of shift that was happening in the 60s that started with tobacco industry, which at that time was needing to diversify, because if you aren't familiar with this extraordinary fact, you've got to see the movie The Insider, about how the tobacco industry's manipulation of the sugar content, primarily of cigarettes, to increase their addictive potential, had been discovered, and they were paying billions to, the myriad sufferers of tobacco addiction. Suits in every state in the union, starting in the Deep South. They really, the tobacco center of the country, they were the ones, I believe it was Arkansas, that would not let the tobacco industry off the hook. So they began to buy up snack food companies instead. What's the commonality here? Why didn't they invest in other things? Why did they invest in snack food? It was because they could see the potential for making snack foods like crude tobacco was in the beginning, a drug substance. They knew that they could continue to refine these foods that were already becoming too refined to the point where they would be completely irresistible. And that's what they have continued to do. And it's been a very, very successful coup for them, obviously. The other thing that happened in the 60s is something that I named my first book for. It was a huge blockbuster at the time and is still selling well. The diet cure is really a double entendre. So it's a cure, a dietary cure, and it's also curing us from our addiction to dieting, which began in the 60s, not because we were concerned about our weight, but because I should have had an image here of Twiggy, who was a model, a British model at the time, who somehow fascinated the entire country. And young women like this one, at this weight and size and shape, decided that, it would be fun to starve, just temporarily, and look like Twiggy for a while, not as a permanent thing necessarily, but just, it was a fad. we had had millions of fads. We had had bustles, we had corsets. So in the 60s, we were letting go of corsets, but we were grabbing hold of the emaciated look. And we have never let go of it. It quickly became a media sensation. Movie directors wouldn't hire actresses who didn't have this look because, you know, the camera put some weight on them. And I mean, that wasn't the reason, but that really was a defining career move for actresses, was to starve themselves. And we have continued to do that because, not as a fad, but because now we're eating a diet that is putting all this unnatural weight on us. And so what is the problem with low-calorie dieting? As far as I know, Twiggy has lived to a healthy old age. I don't know. She said she was just naturally emaciated. And so I'm assuming it was a genetic style. And I myself was teased. It wasn't mean, but it was teasing that I was too thin. And I was through, you know, early puberty. And it wasn't because I didn't want to eat. My metabolism just changed for a while. So what's the matter with yo-yo dieting? The matter is that at this point, so many women and young girls have been dieting for long stretches, maybe through their whole lifetime, for periods. And I think because of this, we are experiencing a phenomenon now. It's one of the things I haven't talked about until today. And that is that the entire population of the country and the parts of the world where it's been monitored, our basal metabolism has gone down permanently. So 98.6 was the universal human temperature. It was established as that hundreds of years ago. And I remember as a child being fascinated that they could tell whether I had a fever because I was above that. And that everyone I knew, you know, parents, children, aunts, uncles, grandparents, cousins, whatever, we all had the same temperature. So I've always been interested in it. And what I have noticed doing an informal survey at the local Kaiser Medical Center for where I go, I've been going for an annual physical. I always get, what's the average temperature now? And the average temperature 10 years ago had fallen to 98 from 98.6. It is now 97. This is unheard of in human history, as far as I know. And no one is yet speculating. It's been acknowledged, there's studies on it, but no one is even speculating about why. But one of the absolutely ironclad, predictable consequences of starvation is a reduction in temperature below the norm to stop us from burning off calories, because the body considers a starvation of any kind for any reason to be life-threatening. And one of the mechanisms for survival in a famine is for the body temperature to go down. So I think it's one of the reasons that we are having an obesity epidemic at this time. 50% of us are obese, and most of us who are obese are morbidly obese, where it's associated with life-threatening illness and early death. Then we get to the 70s. We're still, by the way, eating 3 meals a day, if we're eating at all, you know. And most diets were short-term. We were back to relatively healthy eating. 3 squares were still the rule. So I call the 70s the dietary disaster decade, and I adored the 70s. And neuroscience became a force starting in the 70s. It had been, study of the brain had been in process for several decades, but it really became a force in the 70s and then became like a household word in the 80s. So here we go. This is what happened in the 70s, which I believe is the primary reason that we've become dependent on toxic snack foods today. This is a list of the traditional foods that we lost during that decade. Saturated fat, a big portion of our diet. Everybody had bacon grease on the stove to use for frying anything. Lard, household word, butter. And remember, our weights were normal, our health was normal, our mood was normal. But we cut it by 50%, unprecedented, unresearched. We cut our protein, and this particularly important nutrient, it is the key to our discussion today, by 33%. A third of the average amount of protein consumed was just lopped off. Why? Because protein comes with fat. So a steak is marbled. Whole milk has a layer of cream on top. We dispensed with that. We also our healthy carbohydrate, our traditional carbohydrate consumption went down because by 60%, vegetables, fruit, and the fiber primarily from those foods, although we were still consuming some beans and increasing our whole grain consumption. But these are huge, unprecedented human diet experiments. Then back to the voluntary starvation, the low-cal dieting, much more widely practiced in the 70s because we were gaining weight. There was more ambition to fuel the effort. Now, vegetarian diets were popularized by nature, low in saturated fat and protein, as well as iron, zinc, the absorbable forms of those two critical minerals. So I was aware of this because at the end of the 70s, I was a graduate student intern at an addiction and eating disorders program in San Francisco. And we just saw this huge swell of teenage eating disorders, anorexia and bulimia, and there was a lot of research. Research was heavily funded. What the heck's happening here? And it was always, the answer was always dieting. Low-calorie dieting triggered these eating disorders. So starvation, one of the things that it has led to is an ongoing epidemic of eating disorders. I remember in the high school where I was doing some volunteer counseling, every teenager that I interviewed told me that 90% of the girls were either bulimic or anorexic at that time. And we just got a report this last week, international report, saying that they had made a terrible error in their evaluation of eating disorders incidence surveys. They had not been surveying binge eaters, overeaters, other miscellaneous eating disorders. So we have been falsely assuming that, gee, it hasn't been going up. Well, we were wrong. So now we're going to look at the final facts of our dietary tragedy here. So these are the new things. We took out all these critical pieces of, we don't eat 3 meals anymore, and we don't eat protein, we don't eat fat, we don't eat healthy carbs. So now we've got, in addition to that, the brand new foods, which have created the amount of craving that drives the sales and the consequences of our diet. So free fructose. It's now 50% of the sweeteners that we consume in anything are composed of free fructose. And it's an entirely new sweetener. There wasn't any free fructose that was available commercially. Fruit contains sucrose, which is a mix of fructose and glucose, but they're very, very different when they're isolated. Glucose, the body knows what to do with glucose. Fructose, the body doesn't know. It's not used to dealing with it. This is not an ancient substance that the body knows how to deal with. So that's why it was originally developed in the 70s and put into soft drinks, and we know how deadly they are and how addictive worldwide. But don't think that it's just high fructose corn syrup. It's agave syrup and fruit juice sweetened beverages. In some cases, there's more free fructose in those beverages than there are in beverages and foods that are corn syrup sweetened. So our consumption of processed starches doubled. Well, we had nothing else to eat except sugar. We were afraid of fat and protein because it contained fat. So we're stuck with starches. And so in the 70s, an entirely new form of wheat was developed. They still, as far as I know, and when I was researching the craving cure, there was no research worldwide. We had a buddy, we made friends with somebody in the government who was a specialist in gluten. And he couldn't find, and we couldn't find any scientists who were looking and comparing the new wheat with prior wheat in terms of its gluten content. But what he did say was it's clear that since the 70s, the gluten content, the addition of gluten itself, isolated from the other components of wheat flour, that had increased. So we've certainly seen a lot more intolerance and celiac problems. And the gluten-free starches that have tried to be helpful in that regard have actually kept us in trouble, because they're highly refined. It's really, since starch turns into sugar in the mouth, it's like eating sugar. To have a pizza on a rice flour, with rice flour dough. Okay, and then the vegetable oils, instead of our reliable and extremely stable saturated fats, we've got loaded with cheap, highly damaged vegetable oils that have been deodorized, so we don't know that. And of course, the amount of trans fats made from these cheap vegetable oils has tripled. So finally, our calories went up 30%. I'm surprised it hasn't been more. That's an average, of course. And we've already talked about cold cereal. Only at this point, we were having it with a non-fat milk. And more, of course, we aren't having any breakfast. We are just having caffeine. So this is our final goodbye for the moment to the normal waistline and all of the other things that we've lost. I just want to say something that I used to love saying when I was talking about the mood cure, and that is that everywhere you went in the 50s and even in the 60s, people were whistling. They were singing as they worked. It wasn't a joke. It wasn't a myth. So we lost so much more than our waistline in this tragic decade of the 1970s. And now to the main event. This is my favorite image of the brain in all of its crowning glory. I mean, literally, it is our crown, and it is studded with jewels. And we're going to talk about 5 of them. So you can see there's some jewels are more dominant than others on this crown. So on traditional foods, and what does that mean? That could mean millions of things all over the world. It doesn't matter. Our health and weight and mood were stable. Whatever we were eating that did not include the things that are in foods now. So our healthy feeding instincts were turned on by these healthy foods, and they kept us on a healthy path food-wise. The native appetite. We liked healthy food. And as long as our brain was stocked with these particular nutrients, that these neurotransmitters that govern our experience of pleasure and our appetite for food, they functioned beautifully. The neurotransmitters and our brain blood sugar levels, which are quite unique, very different from the blood sugar needs and functions in any other part of the body. Very, very sensitive. And with our current diet, fluctuating so wildly between too much sugar and too little sugar as insulin pulls the sugar, dangerous high levels of sugar out of our bloodstream, we are experiencing some real emergency low blood sugar states that, as you'll see, fuel major cravings for refined sugar. So now we got an idea of how we got here. What about where we are now? What is the nature of this thing? And an international squad of scientists got together and analyzed these foods that have now become so compelling that they are the primary diet worldwide, these snacks. So they are 60% nutrient void. Clearly, they're high in calories, not from healthy carbohydrates or fats, but from damaged and nutrient depleted carbohydrates and fats. However, what does that mean, 60% nutrient void? We know that they have to add a certain number of vitamins to compensate for the damage to vitamins in the processing, but no one has asked them to restore the quality of the fats and the nutrients that the saturated fats preserve, contain. So pasture-fed butter contains omega-3 fats and protects all the other fats. And in the brain, our main agenda here, saturated fats protect the tissues of the brain. They protect the cell walls in every cell in the brain, so that what's going on there, even though we have to have the omega-3s and some 6s in there to keep the brain cell walls so flexible because they interact with the contents of the cell, the neurotransmitters, so intimately, but the saturated fats have to be there. So what about the other nutrients? Well, we know we're low in minerals because they're big and clumsy and you can't stick very many minerals into a multivitamin. That's why they call it a multivitamin, because the minerals are typically so negligible. On the other hand, it turns out that vitamins and minerals are they're in the cast, there's supporting roles. The stars of our diet, by any measure really, are nutrients that nobody talks about, in spite of the fact that they're the largest nutrients, the most potent nutrients. They are also the least known, the least discussed, the least researched nutrients of all. And without them, the brain repair that we must put in place to turn this empty brain back into our crowning glory is impossible. So they're called amino acids. And I'm going to tell you a story now, that I haven't told before. That is that I have been interviewing an 86-year-old man who is a true pioneer and hero of the nutritional world, and those of us who are looking at nutrition so carefully. And he has been studying amino acids since the 70s, the early 70s, first heading up a very large lab looking at the uses of individual amino acids in skin and hair products, and then developing his own lab for the use of individual amino acids and blends in various health conditions, a wide variety of health conditions. And I'll be talking a little bit more about him later. There's a critically important role that he played in the fact that we can even access these precious nutrients as supplements at this time, because we certainly aren't getting them in our foods. They are not addictive. Protein is not addictive. When we have our compulsive eaters come in, and this was initially before we even knew much about using supplements, we would say, just, okay, you want your cookies or whatever, but eat a salmon steak first. That's the rule. You can have whatever sweets you want, but you have to eat a salmon steak first, or a real steak, or a hamburger patty even. And in those days, when people weren't as nutritionally void as they are now, it would cut their cravings right in half. So amino acids were, by him and many other much more serious scientists like Richard and Judith Wertman at MIT, who wrote a whole bookshelf worth of textbooks about amino acid therapy. One of the most important and hard to get amino acids, even in a good diet, was the most studied molecule on Earth in the late 70s and early 80s. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But they've been hidden in obviously in plain sight. We know they exist. We see them and look blank when we go by them in the shelf at the health food store or on the internet or whatever. But that wasn't true before 1987. They were hugely important because of bullet number 2. We only need 5 of the 20 amino acids that exist in food, which are brain and bodybuilding wonders. There's no other way to put it. I mean, except to be even more silly about praising them. In order to restore our native appetite, our natural optimal levels of pleasure, experience of pleasure, and of a normal healthy appetite, we have to get enough of 5 of the 20 amino acids. There's nothing else that will produce most of the tissues in the body. We're kind of aware that muscles are made out of amino acids, but the fact is that every structure in the body is primarily made of amino acids. They are called the building blocks for a reason. They really are. Vitamins and minerals, fats, whatever, that's the mortar, but these are the blocks. And here are the 5. We're going to be coming back to these over and over again, but I just wanted to dazzle you with the microphotography of these nutrients that are so critical and so critically depleted. And the depletion of these beautiful nutrients is what's causing our worldwide problems with our weight, our health, and our mood, and much more. So let's go back to how this works. In the earlier PowerPoint, I said that there were 2 ways in which toxic food, standard American diet now, disables the brain. And and causes this huge malfunction in our basic experience of pleasure and in our normal appetite for food. So one of them is through intoxication. I want you to think long and hard about this word intoxication, because we think of it in a romantic sense. You know, it's the experience of infatuation. You know, it's the experience of anything that's thrilling. But there is a toxic core to this experience. So in other words, if we're going to experience it, it better be brief, because otherwise we are going to suffer very serious consequences. And in a word, those consequences are addiction. So what is it? What's the nature of addiction in the brain? And why do I ask that question? Because addiction isn't generated anywhere else. It isn't because of a genetic propensity, although that makes the brain more vulnerable. It's not because of trauma. These things make us somewhat more vulnerable, but really, we are hardwired. And in an ancient system that doesn't know how to deal with certain kinds of intoxication. You know, we didn't have access to even honey very often, so we'd overeat it when we had it, but it wasn't there very often. And people wouldn't eat honey if there was sugar available. And that was, you know, starting, 200 years ago. That's how much less addictive, how much more nutritious honey is. So what happens though is a two-step process in the intoxication and addiction process. The first thing that happens is that the substance, in this case, fructose, and a combination of other nutrients that in a refined form particularly are stimulating to the pleasure-producing neurotransmitters. So these substances that are very, very cleverly now constantly researched, how to make them more stimulating, overstimulate the brain, and release 4 different pleasurable neurotransmitters, and at the same time raise glucose levels. So this is an orgasmic rush. And if we could just have an orgasmic rush every once in a while, which we did, when we were having dessert after dinner, but mostly eating whole food, we would be okay, and we would not be addicted. We weren't addicted then. We had access to sugar, but not to high fructose sugar. So what happens after the intoxication phase wears off, and it wears off sometimes in seconds, sometimes in minutes, sometimes in hours, depends on the person and the substance, the food, techno food. So what happens then is that all these receptors that have had to be flown into action and extra neurotransmitters released, create this incredible sensation, are then empty. There aren't enough neurotransmitters anymore. And at that point, we crash and we crave another dose of the drug food that will put us back into something like the state that we've come to love. So why can't we rebound? We were able to rebound from, a piece of cake after dinner and, feel good the next morning. But there's another way in which our current foods are affecting our brain. And that is the malnutrition. So we've got toxicity and we've got malnutrition, and it's a terrible combination. So at this point, there are lots of researchers extensively looking at the brain with brain imaging of all kinds. And I like particularly Nicole Avena, who is really very sensitive to the problems of overeating and the people who are suffering it, and to Nora Volkow, another woman, researcher and neuroscientist who has been the director of the National Institute on Drug Addiction for decades now. Very outspoken, very eloquent, and this is basically what she says at this point, that the contents of our current diet and what isn't in our current diet has the same addictive impact on the brain as alcohol and drugs. She goes on to admit that that addiction is something that NIDA has never been able to find a solution for. And of course, most of their funding goes towards the attempt to find drugs that will correct our appetite. And so millions and millions and millions of dollars spent on that research, and that hasn't produced anything. So we talked about the nutrients, the malnutrition. The key malnutrition is protein malnutrition, specifically the amino acids that fuel these 5 parts of the brain. I've been talking about 5 parts of the brain that program pleasure and healthy appetite. So you can see at the center, the glucose supply to all of them is in peril, because of the nature of our high carb foods, rocketing our blood sugar levels up and down, and the brain has no stored glucose as the rest of the body does. It's just not accessible to the brain so easily, instantly, the way it needs to be. But there is an amino acid that can convert into glucose, and we're going to be talking a lot about it. So, and as soon as I finish this, we can stop and see if there are any questions that have come up. But the 4 neurotransmitters, there are millions of chemicals in the brain and body that have something to do with appetite, and we hear a lot about them, ghrelin and cholecystokinin, and it goes on and on and on. But we have found that if we can support these 4 neurotransmitters and stabilize blood sugar, that all of the cravings disappear for most people almost immediately, that they're exposed to whichever nutrient their particular cravings is fueled by. So let's start with serotonin, which is our natural antidepressant, but it does so much more. It provides us with a decent night's sleep by converting into melatonin, innumerable benefits by converting into niacin. It's a huge source of niacin, and NAD, one of the most currently hot topics. And one of the reasons that we're so low in niacin and NAD and sleep is because the nutrient that we need to create serotonin is very hard to find, even in high protein foods. So we'll talk about that in a minute. So it's our natural sunshine, and it's anxiety and pessimism and irritability and obsessiveness when levels of serotonin are low that accompany the drive for a lot of people to overeat. So then we've got GABA, which is our natural tranquilizer. It neutralizes adrenaline. It is the neurotransmitter that allows us to experience silence. Just to give you an idea, we'll be talking about all of these things later. But so norepinephrine, our natural stimulant. It is a lot of people who have to give up coffee, at least temporarily or reduce or whatever, find that they don't miss it at all when they can shore up their natural stimulant levels with a particular amino acid. And then finally, endorphin is our natural opiate. And so the comfort craver is deficient in endorphin, and that means that without endorphin, we experience much more pain. It is our natural pain reliever, and it is our joy supply. So at this point, we are going to move into how do we fix it? How do we get these 5 critical functions disabled by our current diet, how do we correct them so that we can stop eating our current diet, so that healthy food will taste good to us? Susan, well, do you have any questions on the chat?
There's one comment that the gut biome can also make GABA, serotonin, and other neurotransmitters, and Nerva biome gives more information on this.
That's a very good point that I'm going to go into. Well, I'd be glad to go into it now. What we have found is that without these brain neurotransmitters fully functional, the gut biome work does not have a direct impact or on our appetite and mood for most people. And what we found is, because the nutrients that restore these brain neurotransmitter blood sugar levels take effect within 24 hours, we can correct the diet immediately, which then allows the microbiome to be restored, because it can't be when people are eating toxic food. And because they're addicted to toxic food, they can't just say, that sounds like a great idea, I'm going to fix my microbiome. The reason that the amino acids are so critical is that, used as supplements, individual supplements, is that they restore the foundation of our health. And from there, we can make all kinds of forays into repair work. But if we're continuing to damage our bodies with a toxic diet, it doesn't happen. Anything else?
So on this current slide, can you talk about why dopamine isn't one of the key appetite and mood regulators?
That's an excellent question. I've had many arguments with neuroscientists about this, that what we've found is that as you'll see in when we come to how do we build up levels of norepinephrine, our natural stimulant, dopamine is the first neurotransmitter made from that amino acid, that base amino acid, and then dopamine converts into norepinephrine, and norepinephrine then converts into adrenaline. Well, most people don't need more adrenaline. And when we give someone norepinephrine, the immediate effect is, the amino that builds norepinephrine, which is tyrosine, we get within minutes, we get alertness, physical erectness, brightening of the eyes, and mental and physical energy. What we do not see is any of the direct experiences of reward that dopamine is supposed to give us, which would certainly, we all thought, oh, dopamine, yeah, that's the way to go. And we'll give people tyrosine, which is a direct precursor, and it didn't happen. They got lots of benefits, but they weren't a sense of reward, satisfaction, pleasure, and so forth that dopamine. And the truth is that most of the research that's been done in the last few decades at NIDA and elsewhere has been about enhancing dopamine, and none of it has worked. So I'm just challenging that as even a concept. It's certainly one of the neuroscientists that I've talked to about this says, well, it's the result of all of these neurotransmitters being optimized. And I hope that's enough of an answer. And we can talk about it some more when I'm actually talking about the use of the amino acid precursor to dopamine and norepinephrine.
So some other questions. Well, I have a question. I mean, so you emphasize a few of the amino acids, and if we've got cravings, what if we just take them all, and would that cover us?
Oh, thank you. We'll be talking about that, but the first thing that we were aware of in terms of research on the use of amino acid supplements was the research, very exciting research by a neuroscientist named Kenneth Blum, who put together the precursors to all these things. And he got good results, but it was like 60% improvement, 50% improvement. And he was working with alcohol and drug addicts and finally with food addicts, his last study. But what we can do, and anyone who works with the individual amino acids can target, first of all, which most people don't have all deficiencies in all of these areas. And what we found is that most people, to get 100% relief from the symptoms of craving and negative mood, need to individualize their doses, and that their doses need to be quite a bit higher than you can get in a blend. So let's say you really need your natural anti-stress neurotransmitter GABA. That's the main thing that drives your cravings, and that's been true for a lot of people during COVID. If you take a blend that contains some GABA, then you will get some relief, but it might be 40%. And frankly, people who are really deficient in GABA and stressed to the max are so appreciative of a 40% improvement. But we aren't in the business of doing that at my clinic. We are in the business of getting 100% improvement. So we want people to actually use GABA itself if they're deficient in it, and to quickly maximize their amounts and not have to use it for life, which people who use small amounts typically have to do. How's that?
Sounds good. As another question, what about a vegan? How do they get tryptophan? What do they do? Take supplements?
Well, they take supplements, and I have a big section about that in the Craving Cure, because our diet for millions of years was based pretty exclusively on the hunter-gatherer, and meat was our primary source of nutrition. We are taking our lives in our hands by experimenting with any, and the vegan diet is certainly new to the planet. So, but it's, and we don't know whether there's a drawback to taking any of these amino acids long-term as supplements. Because we never do that. We make sure that people's diets support them dietarily, so that, once their levels are raised by the supplements, they can go off of the supplements. And it's partly because I'm not going to be around when they've been taking them for 10 years, and I don't know what the consequences, and nobody else does either. But that's the option. And it's very important for people to know that plant-based protein powders do not contain tryptophan, and neither do branched-chain amino acid powders, and neither do collagen amino acid powders. So tryptophan, being the source of serotonin, which is so critically depleted, particularly in vegans, is something we really need to have. Whey protein powder, in the same sort of dosing, might have as much as 500 milligrams of tryptophan in the same amount of protein powder. So there's a lot of activity on the internet from bodybuilders, for example, who are saying, we're doing all these branch chains and we're doing tons of glutamine, but we're really depressed. We got great muscles and we eat really well, but we're really depressed. And they're finding that it's because they're using vegan protein powders or branched chain or collagen.
There's a question here, how you determine neurotransmitter levels these days. What do you think of organic acid and 24-hour urine amino acid testing that we have currently?
Well, I think that urine testing is typically a waste of money, and that's at best, and at worst, giving a lot of false information. There's an article on this topic on the ModeCure website, on the blog listings, because we've seen so many people get into real serious trouble by overdosing on aminos they didn't need, because the urine testing showed that they were deficient. It's just, urine is very tricky to, and it's excretory product. It's very tricky to make sense of it. And that's why organic acid levels, I'm not sure what to make of them. But plasma, there's been a lot of, not a lot, but some comparative research. And of course, cerebrospinal fluid levels of neurotransmitters are the most effective, but nobody wants to volunteer for that. A spinal puncture, and then blood platelet testing, which is available at Health Diagnostics Lab in New Jersey, and otherwise is available. There's a lot of research done with it, but it's not very available in labs that we would have access to, except through Health Diagnostics. As far as I know, I haven't searched lately, but when we searched on it before, we had a hard time finding it. It's just great. It correlates with symptoms of deficiency really, really well. But you can only test the catecholamines with it. So serotonin and dopamine, norepinephrine, adrenaline. You can get all those, but you can't get the other neurotransmitters from platelets. They're not stored there. So that leaves us with plasma, which is better than urine testing, but not as good as cerebrospinal fluid or blood platelet testing. But the plasma testing is available more widely. We've found, though, that it's become incredibly expensive. It didn't used to be. I don't know what it is at Genova now. They're kind of famous for their amino acid plasma testing. They have a lot of nice information on the website about it. But I do know that at Health Diagnostics, we use it a lot, that it's $85 per neurotransmitter. And it's a lot more than that. I think it's $800 at Quest or LabCorp. So these things are available and they're helpful. And the other thing that's helpful is to get an amino acid panel, a blood plasma panel, to see how your levels of various, particularly serotonin levels, are doing. Anybody else?
Yeah, there's a couple more questions. One question is, how do you measure the various protein digesting enzymes? I mean, there's a Heidelberg test for HCl, but what about the pancreas proteases?
We don't know about testing them, but we will typically give the enzymes that break down the amino acids for anybody who seems to be having any kind of digestive issue. I mean, a lot of people will come in and say, I don't feel like I'm a vegan because I just don't seem to be able to digest meat. Well, they're typically not blood type O's who seem to have a great facility to digesting meat. So, and their hydrochloric acid levels are known to be lower. So we will do a challenge of hydrochloric acid, and we will do a challenge of a mix of the enzymes, because we figure protease is probably not the only one that's low. And we often have a marvelous response to, relatively low dose super enzyme product that has some of all the digestive enzymes and also some hydrochloric acid. But in other cases, when we do the challenge, and they might need fairly high amounts of hydrochloric acid for a while.
There's another question. Pumpkin and chia seeds for a vegan, are they alternatives for tryptophan?
Well, they have tryptophan in them, but a lot of things have some. It's the amount that's the problem. Most vegan sources of protein do have traces of all of the amino acids in them, but traces is not going to get it when we're seriously depleted. And but we had someone recently who on a scale of 0 to 10 was a 10 in terms of her cravings for junk food carbohydrates. And so she had her, we have a virtual clinic. She had her intake call and said, is there anything I can do between now and the time, I trial my amino acids with you to help me with the cravings? And she was immediately told to increase her nut and seed consumption. And by the time she came in to the second session, which was to actually try out the amino acids that she seemed to need on Zoom with her nutritionist, her cravings were down by 50%. So we got them down by 100% within a week after starting combining the amino acid supplements with her nuts and seeds. These are all great questions.
As a question, what are the best foods to eat to get adequate tryptophan and therefore serotonin? But it sounds like, at least for the cravings, to take supplements, for a short period of time, but just in general.
Well, you can always start by increasing the amount of concentrated animal protein 3 times a day. Eggs, fish, beef, lamb, whatever. And as I say, about a third of our clients in the very beginning, when we were doing this brain repair work, got tremendous benefit just from doing that. And sometimes they didn't need the supplements, but over the last 2 decades, we're just in a trough of junk food. There's no real nutrition out there, so nobody's been able to get 100% restoration of their neurotransmitter levels. That's come to us. That doesn't mean that there could be somebody who has less craving, less serotonin depletion, who might be able to get all they need from especially grass-fed protein sources, animal protein sources.
Now, Mona put an article in the chat, so look at the chat, everybody, and save it at the end. But the article is on how body temperature affects enzyme sluggishness, which sounds interesting. She also comments that Wilson's temperature syndrome is low body temperature without the usual low thyroid markers. To save your chat, there's 3 dots at the bottom. You press them and then click chat, but do it at the end so you get everything.
Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, so this PowerPoint is just getting after some of the scientists who have been working with identifying the role of these amino acids. How do they find out which nutrients are the key when it comes to building up serotonin or GABA or dopamine or epinephrine? Well, that work was done, in the 60s and 70s. And at that time, it was tryptophan that was the most studied molecule on Earth. So there's a huge interest and expertise. And just, as physiologists who are studying the nature of muscle, identified which amino acids are used in muscle. And the reason people in gyms take all that glutamine is because something like 40% of muscle is composed of glutamine, which is another extraordinary wonder amino acid. So it wasn't hard for them to figure it out. And it's basic brain biochemistry. Everybody who studies brain biochemistry knows about amino acid precursors. We've talked about the testing, and I talked about Dr. Blum's studies of precursor amino loading, various kinds of problems. The first one I ever saw was of tyrosine with crack cocaine addicts, and I'll talk about that when we get to that. And then Dr. Daniel Amen, is a very popular psychiatrist who uses SPECT scans and has published fascinating before and after SPECTs. One of them is a client that he referred to us, an extraordinary change in the brain spectrometry reading before and after she got on tryptophan. Let's see. Okay, so can you read this?
It's hard.
Okay, so I guess it's not supposed to be read until I until I blink these things on. So I've talked about a little bit so far. We've gotten into that serotonin, and we'll talk about this more, is fueled by L-tryptophan, which then converts into another form of tryptophan, 5-hydroxytryptophan, or 5-HTP. And so with just about every craving type, in this case, the low serotonin craver, there are two choices. So it's one of the reasons that we do these trials, and they're so much fun. And I've now started posting trials on my YouTube channel. And I urge you to go there and watch people actually take the amino acids sublingually and have responses to them very, very quickly. So the second craving type is the hypoglycemic, the crashed craver. And for them, stabilizing blood sugar, making sure it doesn't go too low or too high, is fantastic for immediately stopping this type of craving is generated by blood sugar levels dropping too low, which is the situation for the most part with most diabetics. You know, it's a progression from hypoglycemia to hypoglycemia, which is diabetes. So we can, using glutamine, so many people who are pre-diabetic and even diabetic, if they're not insulin dependent, are so helped by glutamine, and typically they're deficient in everything. Diabetics are really nutrient deficient, and glutamine is one of those nutrients that they're really deficient in. So type 3, these are the comfort food cravers, and what raises endorphin levels is it's a derivative of phenylalanine, the amino acid phenylalanine, but it's the D form, not the L form. It has a very different, it's not stimulating for most people. It's very, very rare to have somebody get any energy from it, but it does immediately inhibit the enzymes that destroy endorphin. And we see, just this extraordinary, comforting, craving-free effect, again, just, within 5 or 10 minutes. And in terms of raising GABA, our natural tranquilizer for the stress cravers, GABA is an amino acid and a neurotransmitter. So it's probably the reason that we can get wonderful effects at very low doses. Most of the amino acids we start with for adults at 500 milligrams. With GABA, it's 125 milligrams. We do use recommend sublingual GABA for that. And sometimes, people do need more and they end up with a 500 milligram capsule, but it's maybe, I don't know, 25% of the clients. Most of them do well with 125 to 250 several times a day. So the last type is our fatigued craver, and we have to raise the norepinephrine, dopamine, adrenaline, whatever's deficient, so that they will stop craving caffeinated products, mostly with sugar and chocolate. So tyrosine, or in this case, phenylalanine in the L form, is phenylalanine turns into all kinds of wonderful things, and one of them is tyrosine. So if we have somebody who needs lesser dose, something more subtle, for children who we want to give, broadly nutritious supplements to, we go to phenylalanine. I don't know what happened to this. In terms of how to do it, how to make use of these amino acids, the first thing you have to do is assess, and that's why there's a questionnaire in the book and on the website for you to quickly get a sense of how many deficiencies do you have of the 5 possibles that are causing your cravings. And then we do a safety check, which is, we have a page of possible contraindications. The one amino that's the most frequently contraindicated, and that's not very often, but is tyrosine, which can raise blood pressure and is contraindicated with melanoma and hyperthyroid conditions. So anything, but it's, as I say, the others, it's very hard to even remember examples of adverse. But if somebody, but there's all kinds of individuality here, and some people just don't respond well. It's very unusual, but sometimes they don't. But they'll respond well to several other amino acids, but there'll be one that they seem to need, but anyway, so we do the safety check before we trial, and then we trial. We give them the amino, we send them a package. Anybody can order it off the internet or the shop on our website, but at the clinic, we mail them trial packets, a bag of trial packets, little trial packets, so that we can watch them take open the capsules, put them under their tongue, a little bit of water, and watch their, typically it's within 3 to 5 minutes that they'll start having a reaction. And if they don't, then we do a second trial. And occasionally we'll do more than 2 trials. And nothing happens, we'll go to the alternative. So if they don't have any response to tryptophan, we'll try 5-HTP. And so it's a really good method of identifying who needs what before you have to buy whole bottles of any of the aminos. And so based on what dose they seem to get benefit from, it's easy to then dose them, or for readers to dose themselves. And then they use the same assessment tool, which is a page long on the website. It's called the mini assessment. You can print it out from there. It's a 6-week monitoring tool so that you can do your 0 to 10 scores on the symptoms of deficiency and see whether, your scores are going down, and they should go down very, very quickly. And we typically go 0 to 10, and initially, people are from 7 to 10 on a lot of symptoms, but by a month, they're, they would be typically cut 2/3 off of that, so instead of 10, they maybe be a 3, and by 8 weeks they don't have any, they're pretty much all zeros. So adjusting the doses and then terminating. You don't need it anymore. I'm getting plenty of protein, they're getting plenty of protein in their diets, and they are quickly adopting a traditional healthful diet. So what that means is typically within 24 hours, initially we were getting phone calls from people saying, we are just checking in. We asked them to check in initially. Now we don't, because the results are so predictable. And they would always say exactly the same 3 words: "This is amazing." They would get their healthy food. They were going to try another diet, and sure enough, this one was easy. They weren't craving any junk food anymore. So eventually, after a few months, for adults, they don't need the supplements anymore to keep those cravings at bay, and also the negative moods and so forth that accompany each of these neurotransmitter deficiency. So this is the 1-page. It's kind of an elaborate version, but it's the version that we use to help us by having them fill it out, identify. And here's the 1-sheet precautions chart, and that's somebody getting trialed. So once we've trialed them, then we will start dosing, and depending on their age and sensitivity, as you can see, we individualize, and the Craving Cure has a section that's just on assessing and dosing, so you don't have to guess. I think this is what that process looks like over about 8 weeks. We can't see it. Then there's a final one, so it's probably 12. We can't see that last one where it's all zeros, but you get the idea that, you know, initially their scores were quite high, and in all these, this is an actual person, and in all the categories, all of her scores were elevated. Her mood was, you know, abysmal, and so were her cravings, and you can see that there was a quick drop as soon as the amino acids came in, and in the first one, which is the serotonin levels, you can see that the levels went up, and then they went down again. And in her case, as in the case with a number of the menstruating women that we've worked with, it was during PMS she needed more amino acids because the imbalances in her sex hormones affected her neurotransmitter production. And so, but just increasing during that time, you know, just for a week or so, took care of it. And so this is how we and anyone can monitor their progress and make sure that they get to that all zeros final score. So here the deficiency in low serotonin, that type 1 craver, the depressed and anxious craver, you can see what a long list of deficiency symptoms, you know, it's really a great burden to be deficient in serotonin. So take a look at all that and see. One of my trainees, I run an advanced neuronutrient therapy training program, and one of our psychotherapists who's taken it this last time had a tremendous phobia with snakes, and she lived in a rural area, and her husband, Native American from the same area, you know, of course, played with snakes and whatever, but it completely disappeared when she took tryptophan. And she was somebody who wasn't afraid of protein. She was not a vegan, but she needed a lot of stress over many years in her life, various kinds. And you know, she would skip meals and, you know, crave carbs, and so rely on caffeine. At any rate, just to give you an idea, of course, insomnia, night owl, we're typically looking at the serotonin not converting to melatonin at night, and that's easy to sort out. So tryptophan or 5-HTP between meals when those symptoms are evident. So a lot of times low serotonin people, depressed cravers, are pretty good in the morning. They're morning people because sun helps convert tryptophan into serotonin. But almost everybody drops in the afternoon and evening who's low in serotonin, because there isn't any light then, or it's disappearing, and the body is busy converting serotonin into melatonin. So it's not available for preventing cravings and negative moods. Here we go with the type 2 hypoglycemic cravers. Regardless of what's going on, when their blood sugars drop, they feel stressed, mood swings, and they may wonder what the heck, they can be dizzy, certainly inattentive, headachy. We had one gal that lost 100 pounds, got on a good diet, but had chronic headaches. And then she'd been in Overeaters Anonymous recovery for a long time, and she came on our staff. And she really liked glutamine, but it didn't do the whole thing. So we gave her chromium, and that she never had another headache. So she was one of those people who was really deficient in both. And she was definitely on her way to diabetes, so she was pre-diabetic prior to her recovery. With dosing on glutamine, it again starts 500 milligrams, and a lot of people like taking it under their tongue especially if they forget to take their capsules between meals, because they can start feeling that blood sugar drop. And if they put it, just open a capsule, even without water, it's very pleasant tasting under their tongue, it'll disappear. But we always I helped develop a multi called True Balance. And there's another good one called Glucobalance that's very high in chromium. And it's marvelous for any kind of blood sugar abnormality. Let's see. Well, you can see of the possible scores, which are the red column, in week 1, out of 21, she had 16. That was her score. So it went down, but not nearly enough. But by week 6, she was down to 8. And by week 12, she had no symptoms at all. And her A1Cs were normal when she was retested at that point. And she had a 15-pound weight loss because of it. And that, some people don't, they have to, they don't crave and their calories go way down, but a lot of them have thyroid and other issues that are slowing down metabolism. But many people, it's really just diet related, turn off the cravings, quit eating the junk food, and it goes away. So here are comfort cravers with the endorphin depletion. And so they are very common among food cravers. Maybe, perhaps the most common type of food craver is a comfort craver. And here are their symptoms. And so that loving, thinking of that, immediately describing your cravings as love. I love chocolate, and a beautiful, what I call endorphin smile that comes with it. So when I think of reward, I think of endorphin sufficiency. What we see when we give D-phenylalanine, and that need for comfort and reward. And these are people who talk about whatever their favorite foods are really their best friends. They just can't feel that way with people. It's the substance. But when we use D-phenylalanine, or with some people, the DL form is a little more energizing, or whatever the reason is. Some people do better on DLPA than DPA. And again, it's starting with 500 milligrams for most adults, and sensitive adults and children less. So these are the things that are high endorphin, that trigger a high endorphin response, the drug-like response: chocolate, sugars, fats, salt, and cannabis. I'm talking about food additives here. It's certainly a common additive. But also gluten. Gluten itself plugs into the endorphin receptors, and so does casein, milk products. So people who really, are addicted to pizza, typically they need to take care of some dietary things, which are easy to do when their endorphins are, being taken care of by the amino acid therapy. And here is our stress craver. And it's not only mental stress, but literally the painful muscles, especially the neck and shoulders. And you really watch them relax during the trialing. It's really fun and amazing. And with that problem, about maybe 10% of people don't respond to GABA, but they do respond to L-theanine in almost exactly the same way. So that's another reason we trial, to see, what do they need and at what doses. The dosing is a little bit different between the two. One of the trialers that you'll see on my YouTube channel, I call Reality Research, watching people actually take these supplements. Her response to GABA was really fun to see. And so again, the red was, the highest possible score, which was almost 50. And so the first GABA that she took, her symptoms right before she took her first GABA trial dose, was what, 30, about 30. So it was quite high. And but after the trial, about, I don't know, just 3 minutes, you'll see the whole period of time from the time she swallows it to the time she starts reporting relief. So it went down to 5. So I urge you to look at this is the last craving type, a fatigued craver who needs help with any or all of these symptoms, 0 to 10 score. And these are the substances that they're typically craving to help them through. And tyrosine or phenylalanine, if they're sensitive or young. Tyrosine is stronger than phenylalanine, as I mentioned before, 500 milligrams for adults. It's the starting dose, but people might need 2 or even 3, usually 3 times a day. The most, typically 2 twice a day, that's kind of an average. And then depending on the severity scores, that's why it's so helpful to have the questionnaire. These are kind of the average times when they can expect to get no symptoms. And once that happens, then they can start going off one by one or all at once, whatever they want. But one by one is easier to deal with. You know what's happening. Because if you go off of everything at once and you still have some cravings, you don't know which one you still need. Or do you need all of them, but maybe at a lower dose. So you can play with, everyone plays with it very successfully. And then if there are any adverse symptoms that start up after you start taking the aminos, then we suggest you just stop taking it. And if all the benefits go away too, then to take it at like a half dose and see if, or take the optional amino instead. So, and then take off with whatever traditional diet appeals to you, because you're cured. So, anybody have any final questions or comments?
Yeah, there are questions here. Let's see, first of all, what is your website?
It's juliarosscures.com.
Second
So
question. Yeah.
all the books are on it. There are 3 different books, 3 different blogs, forums, and all kinds of things for each book.
And then there's a question. Would you specify, I guess, which amino acid you'd have to be careful of if you have low thyroid or Hashimoto's?
Well, low thyroid isn't typically a problem. In fact, thyroid hormones are made out of tyrosine and iodine. So sometimes, we don't see it often, but sometimes just taking tyrosine will be helpful to a low thyroid person. But for Hashimoto's, tyrosine is something that I would say in about half, or maybe a quarter, at least a quarter or a third of our Hashimoto's people don't like tyrosine, except at very low doses. And we wouldn't have anyone, with hyperthyroidism take it at all. But with Hashimoto's, it's really on an individual basis. And so if they want to trial it and they seem to have a lot of symptoms of deficiency, we'll have them start at maybe with phenylalanine or at a half dose of the tyrosine, or even less, just to trial it out.
Okay. We have a question about your experience with Parkinson's disease.
I wish I had someone, I've never had anybody with autism come to our clinic, or with Parkinson's. So with Parkinson's, the problem is the conversion between tyrosine and L-DOPA to dopamine and norepinephrine and so forth. And I do know that you can take L-DOPA. It's through compounding pharmacists. And quite a few people seem to like macunabine. We don't use it at all because it does have other adverse effects for some people, which is very high in L-DOPA as well. But I actually shouldn't say anything about it because I don't know a thing about the effectiveness of amino acid therapy with Parkinson's, never having worked with it.
Okay, one person asked, you see clients virtually. I mean, so like if somebody wanted to see you, can the whole thing be done virtually?
Yes, we only see people virtually now. So when I had to leave the clinic to write the book because I went to New York and I got a huge advance, but they wanted it done fast. And so I had to take full time off. And so at that point, we decided to make it a virtual clinic. I would supervise, and I still am. And cravers are our, primary customers because we started, the clinic to get ready for the people who were going to read the book and want some advice, support, etc.
Okay, one person asked, what about morning headaches?
Morning headaches, it's very common for them to be hypoglycemic. And so glutamine and chromium are both sovereign for hypoglycemia. But I think the person would probably know whether it was blood sugar related by whether it went away when they ate. And although there are people that, until they take the supplements, they like the person that lost 100 pounds. She didn't have cravings, but she had the headache. So the other thing is tryptophan. If you have scores indicating you're low in serotonin, and headaches are one of the symptoms of low serotonin, including migraines.
Okay, there's a question about diabetes. Have you been able to help people avoid adding a diabetes medication due to increasing blood sugars? Have you helped people with diabetes to get off of their medications entirely with the addition of amino acids? On the other hand, what do you think of taking Ozempic?
Could you start one at a time? The questions.
Okay, first question. Have you been able to help people avoid adding a diabetes medication when the blood sugars are increasing?
Yes, absolutely. Because we know that diabetes, you could see that there wasn't any diabetes in the 1950s, and it was almost none in the 60s. So it's a diet triggered disease, and we can stop the cravings. So we use the same tool with diabetics that we use with everyone to measure their neurotransmitter function to see which neurotransmitters are behind their cravings. And we have a client right now. As a matter of fact, this is a client of the woman who lost her snake phobia. He was diabetic. He is diabetic. He also had prostate cancer, and during COVID, they didn't see him, so his prostate cancer got worse. And his PSAs were 400. They're supposed to be under 100. His glucose was very high. It was over 300, and they wanted him to get it down to 150, ideally under 100, his glucose levels. And the last time she reported in on him, his PSAs were less than 1 from 400, and his prostate cancer was not spreading, and his glucose tolerance was under 100. His glucose levels rather were under 100. So yes, absolutely. And and then we've had other people who on medication that we were able to transfer off of that. In fact, everybody who's diabetic on medication has to work with their doctor first. And what happens is you have a diabetes doctor and you tell them, I'm going on a diet, And so they say, okay, I'm going to lower your medication, but tell me immediately if when you fall off, because everybody falls off of a diabetic diet without this kind of support. I shouldn't say everybody, but most people and the doctors certainly feel like it's everyone. And we had one gal who wouldn't do it. She didn't really believe that the aminos would be that dramatic. So she didn't go to the doctor. She didn't lower her medication. And she had a very adverse experience. So however, they worked it out and normalized things, just kind of gradually altering the medication and the amino acids.
Have you helped people with diabetes get off all of their medications with the addition of amino acids?
Yeah, I just answered that question. We have.
And what do you think of a medication called Epidemic?
I don't know what it is, but we would certainly do this first.
Okay. Have you ever seen the tyrosine or the phenylalanine feeding Clostridia imbalances in the gut? This was brought up at a GPL workshop this past weekend.
What were the two aminos that
Tyrosine and phenylalanine.
We have not had GI adverse symptoms with those two amino acids particularly, no.
Okay. Do you see beneficial support from fermentation products such as kombucha, kefir, sourdough, kimchi?
Well, we've seen lots of kombucha addicts. There's plenty of sugar in kombucha. So we take everybody off of caffeine and kombucha and anything else that could be having a drug-like effect that seems to be addictive. And because it's so easy, they're fine with that.
Now, I believe you've already answered this, whether the results generally hold after the termination of the amino acids, and I believe you answered it yes. Is that correct?
Well, as long as the diet can, it's a very good question. As long as the diet can continue to provide the 3 squares, with protein as the star. Yes. And some people, they get very ill or, something happens and they can't eat and their cravings will come back and then they will find themselves craving for those, or occasionally they'll have an extremely, traumatic loss or whatever, and find themselves drawn towards comfort foods. And what we found is that all they have to do is go back to the chart, identify which symptoms, there are some breakthrough symptoms, cravings associated with them. And so, for example, with the loss, the grieving, the D-phenylalanine to raise endorphin levels is just wonderful. It's not that they don't grieve, but they're not completely incapacitated and they don't turn to alcohol or toxic foods for comfort anymore.
Have you ever worked with people who are anorexic?
Oh, yes. And the beauty of it is that they're not afraid of supplements because they don't have any calories. So we can start repairing their brain chemistry, their mood chemistry, and their thinking improves. And it's tremendously helpful in their recovery because their fear of food, the irrational thoughts and so forth really diminish.
Now, here's a question. Can you reverse diabetes so you no longer have it? I think the answer to that you've kind of alluded to, that it's a dietary disease, so your sugars might be stabilized, but if you go on a bad diet, the sugars will be unstabilized. I suspect that's the answer.
Well, most people are on a bad diet and they're taking medication to offset it, and it's just it's not a good thing.
Now, here's an interesting question. Have you studied what happens to people's body temperature as they follow your protocols and these other aspects improve?
Well, the only people that we have checked on body temperature with are the people who still have the symptoms of low, they have cold hands and feet, they're exercising, but it's kind of hard because their energy isn't so great. and they're not losing weight, even though their diet has changed radically. Those people, we want to know what their temperatures are. And they're almost universally below normal, quite often below 97, 95, 96. So at that point, we help them find a naturopath or a physician to help them normalize.
Here's
the
an
thyroid.
Here's an interesting question. Any caveats for somebody who has regular thoughts of self-harm? I don't know if that be through self-mutilation or suicide. Those are two different phenomenon, but any caveats?
Could you have, I mean, why don't I address both? And it's a great distinction that you're making there. So self-harm, that could be over-exercising, that could be cutting oneself, tattooing even, although they wouldn't admit it was harmful. But so that is a clear-cut symptom, and it's on the symptom list for low endorphin. Because it turns out that these traumatic things, like cutting and over-exercising, will trigger an endorphin sort of survival boost. Endorphin is part of the stress response. So by raising endorphin levels, we get people, who lose their interest in formerly extreme self-harm. But when we're talking about suicide, that is not something that we have seen very often. And when we have seen it, it has appeared to us to be beyond what we could help with alone. So we have typically referred people to, like locally, we had for a long time a psychiatrist who was so wonderful that worked with us. So we would get as much benefit as we could with the nutrients. But meanwhile, she was waiting with lithium or lamotrigine medication at the lowest possible dose. Now we trial lithium orotate with everyone, frankly, and find it has wonderful benefits. But with a serious suicidality, typically these nutrients are not enough, because quite often suicide is something that people with bipolar disorder suffer, or unipolar disorder. In other words, it's not consistent. These neurotransmitter deficiency symptoms are always there. Oh yeah, I always feel depressed, or I always feel worried, or, but that's not true for someone who cycles. So there's another dynamic, and sometimes lithium orotate can be helpful. We've found it tremendously helpful for less severe symptoms of bipolar, what we call undiagnosed subclinical bipolar. But with suicide, we really need more help, and tell people that immediately. And the same with psychosis and schizophrenia. But we've had some tremendous success with psychosis and schizophrenia. Once they're on a stabilizing medication, they have wonderful responses in terms of the quality of their mood and life. Once that dynamic in the brain is taken care of. The thing that I am most hopeful about when it comes to suicidality is to find out more about ketamine. Just reading about it, and know of two cases, a 14-year-old and a 62-year-old who got tremendous relief from ketamine, which is an anesthetic. It's not a permanent medication, it's infusions. Anybody on the call who knows anything about ketamine treatment for suicidality? No.
Here's another question. For somebody who's not willing to biohack or experiment and says they're interested only on large-scale placebo double-blinded trials, is there any comprehensive fact sheet that you could provide for them, as the person asking the question's not been able to persuade them to read your books or watch videos? What could you point to that might help these people to try your protocol?
Let's see, are we talking about food craving here?
I suspect so. It's Mona's questions. So she patiently had her hand up for a long period of time. So Mona,
Fine.
chime in.
Mona is, are you talking about food cravings or mood? Or both?
No, mood.
Mood, okay, that's a whole different topic. And because there's very interesting research on the use of amino acids for addictive disorders, whether it's food, alcohol, drugs, behaviors. But the best source, which is the only textbook written on amino acid therapy, was written in 1985. So that was when there was tons of research on it. And I'm always going back to that book. It's called The Hidden Nutrients Within. And the author is the real pioneer in individualized amino acid therapy, psychiatrist and biochemist Carl Pfeiffer, Pfeiffer.
Now, Sydney reports Keteman's story concerning suicide that had a negative effect. So that's
it make things worse. Is that what you're saying?
Looks like it. Sydney, chime in.
Okay, thank you, Sydney.
I'm happy to tell you my nephew briefly. He went on ketamine therapy and it looked like it was helping him with his depression, but then it wasn't kept track of during the pandemic. And he took a lot. It changed his personality completely. He stopped his antidepressants suddenly and committed suicide. So I think it can be a positive thing. I think the context really matters.
Thank you. Yeah, this 14-year-old was shy, introverted, but highly functional kid and happy, seemed to good family and so forth. And suddenly at 14 became violently suicidal, and there were no circumstances, nothing to explain it, and they got all kinds of therapy and tried everything and medications, and nothing helped. And finally they went to a local clinic run by a MD and his social worker wife, and I met the mother 6 months later, and he was actually better than he'd ever been in terms of more comfortable socially and so forth. And he was no longer taking ketamine. It had been some months since he'd had any.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like something you want to take long term. We have a question here. What's the best book of yours related to diabetes that talks about diabetes?
Oh, by far the Craving Cure. And if you go to the index and look up diabetes, you'll find all the special information that I have there for diabetics.
Anybody have any other questions?
Well, these have been great. All of them have been great. And just what I would expect.
And if you've got any final parting words, and I'm getting feedback, fantastic. Some great information, beautiful service you provide, your patients. Going to check out your YouTube website. All the best for you from Rose. Thank you. Thank you. I mean, I'm getting so many positive accolades. It's quite a bit. Thank you for
I'm so glad.
So
I'm so glad you found it helpful.
Audience.
I only wish we could be in the same room together. Let's say next year we're going to do this again. And
let's. And for the people from the GPL, some of you are here where I posted. If you want to be on our mailing list, go to the website, Silicon Valley Health Institute, SVHI, and just email us or ask to be on the list. We have a meetup called the Silicon Valley Health Institute. I posted on MeWe. I posted on Facebook under the Silicon Valley Health Institute, but Facebook half the time won't let me post. They just won't let me do it. And again, if you want to be on our email list or join the meetup or MeWe or Facebook, I'll put the information on there, but they don't let me post a lot. Or you can be on our email list for the newcomers. We have a speaker every month. Next
Thanks,
month,
Susan.
yeah. So anyway, so we bring in experts for all over the world. We put these on our website, although I'm having trouble with the editing at the moment. So anyway, that's our story.
Hi, Rose.
Julia, you've been wonderful. To
Thank
get
you.
a copy of this, hopefully if I can figure out how to do the editing, I will put it on the website, but the editing's come out like 200 gigabytes, which is not